China. Love them or hate them, they've definitely made a splash. China is the second largest economy, most populous country, a major diplomatic and military power, and probably at least half the things in your house were made there. It's insane how fast China has grown from an impoverished farming country to a modern industrial superpower. I mean, it has been the fastest growth in poverty reduction ever in human history. So when you look at how far they have come and extrapolate the trends a little further, it seems inevitable that China will overtake the USA, Russia, Europe, maybe all combined as the major world power. That couldn't be more wrong though. Modern day China is a very fragile country with a couple existential crises it is facing and many different ways it could implode on itself. Just as fast as China came into the modern world, in a couple decades, China could very well leave it, or at least leave the position of power they have been in for the 21st century. Will China exist in its current form in a couple of decades? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe a new government or a split up country will come out of it. So let's look at the explosions of China. One into a modern superpower and the next one out of one. You have to look at the playing field first, right? Where do the Chinese live? China, duh. Okay, zoom out a little bit. China occupies most of what we call East Asia, or just Asia if you get rid of all of this. China is roughly boxed into its current location with the Gobi Deserts and frozen Siberia to the north, hilly jungles to the south, the Himalayas and a massive plateau to the west, and ocean to the east. But when you're looking at the region called China proper, it shrinks a lot, getting rid of these western portions. Historically, this is where the Han Chinese have lived, and during times of Han power, then they have controlled Xinjiang and Tibet in the west. Its borders help China defend itself, but it also goes both ways, trapping China into its little box. Generally, most decisions are made from inside China proper. And by decisions, I mean countless civil wars, genocides, and some of the highest death toll statistics out of any battles in history. Why do the Chinese love killing each other so much? The answer is its geography again. See, there are 3 rivers you should know about in China: the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, and the Pearl River. These rivers and their surrounding areas make up roughly the 3 regions of China. Let's go through them. In the north, by the Yellow River, is the North China Plain. Plain means flat, and it's not that big of a region. It's great for farming, but anyone could either ride a horse or ride a tank around this plain and get anywhere they want within 2 weeks. It doesn't help that so many people live here, and is usually prone to droughts and or floods since it's so flat and dry. Typically, a ton of coordination is needed to get this region to produce enough food to feed the massive population, and when it historically wasn't provided, mass famines come. That coordination, by the way, usually comes in the form of bureaucratic and authoritarian rulers commanding control over Beijing, the region, and if they're successful, China too. When you think of this China, you're thinking of the north where autocracy thrives. The Qin dynasty, Qing dynasty, Ming dynasty, and Chinese Communist Party were all born out of this plain. The name of the game for the rulers of the north is to grab onto power and make sure nobody else can. And you know the old saying, China's whole again, and then it broke again. Part of this is due to the fact that a pretender government can easily pop up and mobilize in the North Plain, or in this region below it. The Yangtze River makes up the middle portion of China. It is by far the largest river and waterway system in the country. When you think of this China, you're thinking of this region. This is where much of China's economic, agricultural, manufacturing, and industrial power is kept, simply because of the water. It's just way easier to ship over water than on land. The quintessential point of this region is Shanghai, where the Yangtze meets the East China Sea. The city has always been China's largest and probably its most important too, especially as a shipping center for everything in the center of China. And then there's the Pearl River, which makes up southern China. Here it is hot, humid, mountainous, and filled with jungle. This is the region which has escaped northern rule the most and has developed its own unique cultures. Most people even speak another language here over Mandarin. When you're thinking of this China, you're thinking of southern China. The rugged coastline and jungle-filled mountains have made many breakaway cultures found here. Hong Kong, Hainan, Sichuan, and Taiwan are just some to name a few. Of course, China today acts as one large power, but we're also living in a time of Chinese strength where the northern rulers can exercise control and unify China forcefully. This has been the story of China for the last 3,000 or so years. The northern plain fights with itself or gets conquered. It then conquers the Yangtze and then the South if they're lucky, increases their authority so no one else can challenge them, makes the people get to work so there's no famines, hopefully, and when the economic conditions or standard of living eventually drops from mismanagement or outside forces, either a new government pops up, usually ending in a countrywide civil war where millions die, or the existing government doubles down on their authority and then there's a civil war where millions die. Rinse and repeat and you have all of Chinese history. The current government of China is just on another cycle of this pattern, likely on the double down on authority after standard of living's drop part. But before that came the part with the fastest economic growth in human history. So let's look at that explosion to understand the next explosion of China. So if China was so poor for most of its history and lived on a razor-thin sustenance farming style system, how did they become the biggest power in the region and second richest country on earth? Pre-World War II, China was always a rural, agricultural, peasant society. It wasn't until after that war and after a usual civil war where it would make a big change. The side which won was the Chinese Communist Party under Chairman Mao. Of course, after winning a Chinese civil war, he got paranoid, tightened control, became a dictator, and purged counter-revolutionaries. One thing was different about Mao than the rest of the Chinese leaders though, he wasn't an emperor, but he acted like one. Even though during his time China was still rural and a little peasanty, he didn't believe that's what China should always be. He wanted to industrialize China, ASAP. He had a 5-year plan, getting rid of landlords, prosperous farmers in favor of commune farms with a controlled economy forcing people into heavy industry too. It was decently successful with manufacturing, mining, cement production, electricity production, and the whole 9 yards booming. Was it the best stuff? No. They used quotas which discouraged quality, but what it lacked for in quality, it made up for in quantity. There were just so many young Chinese pumping this industry into new heights. We can do better, said Mao, and he set a new plan. A great leap forward to make China a modern industrial power, getting the farmers off the farms and putting them into factories. Turns out, that would also be the cause of the worst famine in human history with anywhere from 15 to 55 million dead. Most Chinese leaders try to force their populations onto the farm, not off of it. After a forced shift back to agriculture, Mao thought of trying another change, the Cultural Revolution. We'll purge the traditions of old China to set up a new, pure state and finally become a modern industrial powerhouse. 20 million then died in the purges and executions that followed. Basically, Mao and his authoritarian mismanagement stunted China's growth immensely, doing much more damage than good. I mean, killing tens of millions of your own citizens is not the best strategy for nationwide growth. China sucked and most people were impoverished, but he did do one thing to help sow the seeds for modern China. He forced everybody into small cities, apartments, and factories and made them get to work, aka industrialization. Even if it wasn't natural and caused so much pain in the long run, it still happened. And it left the new leader, Deng Xiaoping, a much better start to finally grow China when Mao died in 1976. Deng saw the flaws of Mao-style government and economy. He started with denouncing and reversing some cultural revolutionary policies and then moved on to reforming the economy and let foreign investment in. I mean, Mao wasn't the most popular on the world stage. Even the Soviets hated him, so when he died, China was a lot friendlier for foreigners. His new economy boiled down to reducing government planning with less government monopolies and more competition, and opening up some cities to special zones of capitalism. It was called socialism with Chinese characteristics, aka corporatism, aka semi-controlled capitalism, but the government still gets the only and final say on any projects. Starting now, the Chinese used their massive young population to undercut most of the world in manufacturing. It was at the perfect time. The first world had much more expensive labor, the third world had no manufacturing capabilities at all, and it was at the height of the Cold War when the US would protect anyone's trade as long as they hated the Soviets. Political reforms were planned too, but after a couple protests in this square, the government stopped them immediately and Deng stepped down as leader. During the 90s, the growth of China really started to take off, growing at least 5% a year for decades. A mix of foreign investment and perfect demographics made China the exporter for everything. For the 2000s, that 5% growth rate looked more like 10% at a minimum. They became the second largest economy, passing Japan, and experienced the fastest poverty reduction in human history. China builds like it's nothing. New cities, roads, ports, infrastructure, buildings, high-speed rail, and ghost towns pop up in a couple of months, with China using half of the concrete on Earth, which is less of a strong point and more of a sign of the end times, as you'll see. Sure, it has slowed in the 2020s, but the progress made is still unfathomable. And since Xi Jinping took power in 2013, he has done what many other Chinese leaders have done: tightened his authority. You may have heard him getting rid of term limits, implementing a social credit system, zero COVID tolerance, even if it means locking everyone in their house and starving them, mass killings and forced labor in its western provinces, mass surveillance and knowing where and who everyone is with facial recognition, although we probably have that in the West too. Why is he doing this? Because he knows there is a political and economic crisis coming to China in the not too distant future. Chinese history says that the Chinese people have traded freedom for prosperity and security a long time ago, and it still stands to this day. Whenever conditions worsen, it's gonna get ugly. Simply put, Xi Jinping is preparing for the second explosion of China. China is facing a three-front storm, from its people to its money to its stuff, or in fancier words, its demographics, finance, and security. Let's start with its people. Obviously, in terms of people, China is the biggest country on Earth. That is, if it's telling the truth about its statistics. But don't get too used to a world with over 1 billion Chinese people. And I know it's been talked about to death, but the demographic collapse of China is seriously one of the biggest crises the modern nation is facing. It's simple: less people make less stuff, and the Chinese have built their economic system around having endless supplies of cheap labor. Some estimates put the peak Chinese population happening in the 2030s, but some say it has already happened in the mid to late 2010s. Whatever is true, it's still gonna collapse. Why? Two main causes: trying to get rich and government control. In order to get rich in the modern world, you have to industrialize. In order to industrialize, everyone has to leave their sprawling rice paddies and move to a densely populated city, and kids turn from free labor into a very expensive choice, so people start having fewer kids. The faster a country industrializes, the faster it stops having kids, and the faster the eventual collapse. Unfortunately for China and much of East Asia, they were second to the whole industrialization game, which meant that they knew what to do and got it done fast. Along with Mao's pushes for industrialization and Deng's opening up to the world, China industrialized in about 2 decades compared to about 10 in the UK. China's sprint into industrialized nation meant that its collapse was always inevitable, but then the leaders went back and shot it in the head. Mao looked at all the kids and thought that China was screwed. They couldn't ever fit them all into one society, so he implemented a 2-child policy. In 1980, Deng Xiaoping reduced it so that every family could only have 1 child, no tiny apartments needed. The 1-child policy lasted until 2015, when it was increased to 2 children, then 3, and then got rid of entirely. And now, surprise, China is the fastest aging nation on the planet, and the average Chinese is older than the average American now. By 2030, there will be 4 pensioners to 2 taxpayers to 1 child, and by 2050, over 1/3 of the Chinese people will be over 60 years old. When you've got a couple of retirees, they'll play some mahjong and relax while drinking tea. But when you have twice as many retirees as workers, you have a country that isn't working. Generally, young people consume many goods like schooling, houses, and iPhone 14 Pros. Middle-aged people export many things since they're usually more experienced and add more value than younger people, and retirees do neither. China is a system that was built on exports, so when its population bulge was in its middle age in the 2000s and 2010s, China's boomers were booming, but now it won't be. Without its exports, China will have an incredibly difficult time funding its hyper-growth and its imports, something which terrifies the current government. Sadly, it's extremely unlikely to fix itself. Because of the 1-child policy and the preference for males over females in Chinese society, there are about 40 million more young men than women. Those are men who will never marry and start a family, at least if they stay within China. Some consequences of this include an underlying social anger with social unrest much more common, maybe throwing all these young men into the military, many of them leaving the country furthering the collapse, and also somehow a financial bubble on the verge of blowing up. Even if China somehow got all the kids to stop playing League of Legends and got them to a gender imbalance will still lower the birth rate significantly. Most countries try to fix a collapse by letting in new immigrants, but China can't. Less than 0.1% of its population is made out of foreign-born citizens. China is a very homogeneous society with its culture and honestly, its language too hard to integrate into to outsiders. This all leads to a reported birth rate of 1.16 and no immigration as a backup, aka just over one child per woman. China could very well have less than half of its current population by 2100, likely much sooner than that though. It's not hard to see the increasingly panicked authoritarian government do something to keep the grannies and grandpas working, or even scarier, getting rid of them. The number 2 problem is cold hard cash, baby. The green, the cheddar, the bag, the gabagool, the Chinese yuan. Now it's hard to know for certain the real values of economic statistics in China. I mean, this guy, Li Keqiang, says he doesn't even trust their economic data and he's the premier, aka number 2 in command in China. What makes up their GDP though? Duh, exports. Half the things in your house were probably made in China and exported to you, assuming you're not Chinese. We think of China as the factory of the world, exporting anything and everything they can. Chemicals, electronics, food, steel, machinery, vehicles, blah blah blah, you name it. But exports don't actually run the Chinese economy. Absolutely, China is the world's largest exporter by a long shot, but it's also the second largest or largest importing country as well. When you count up net exports, it only adds up to about 2% of the Chinese GDP. Another 40% is consumption, which has a dangerous future without the young people to buy everything, and 60% is made up from investments. That's right, China is not an export-led economy, not by a long shot, but an investment-led one. This map shows the regions of China by economic sector. That's a whole lot of red. It's a bit of a lie though, as by investment it actually means investment and government projects, which together make up about 60% of GDP. Since China likes to call itself a communist nation, there aren't many financial assets to invest in though. Oh well, there's always housing. The Chinese housing bubble is crazy, with the average house 36 times the average income, as compared to 5% in the USA. Part of the reason is investing, part of it is cultural, with more houses seen as a higher class person, especially among young men who can't find a wife. Housing makes up 30% of GDP and accounts for 30 to 40% of bank loans. If housing pops, so does China's economy and so does the system. The Chinese finance model is less of hyper-finance and more hyper-finance. China will build massive projects like it's nothing. Infrastructure, industrial plants, transport systems, huge water transfers, education, healthcare, ports, dams, you name it. It's all part of that hyper-investing structure China is really built on. The Chinese government is willing to spend any amount of money as long as the project will promote Chinese unity, which means the country builds a lot of crazy projects, but it also leads to projects like incredibly strict policing, especially during COVID, mass facial recognition, censoring the internet, and social credit systems. Money does not come from thin air, and they have loans with a capital L, with debt likely reaching somewhere north of 350% to 400% of GDP, compared to about 140 in the US, or credit reaching over 30 times this amount in 2000, by far the biggest increase worldwide. The Chinese government has a reason for all of this. CCP legitimacy is based on economic growth and unity. Any slight dip in economic conditions gets people a little riled up and in the mood to protest. Or more simply, keep the people working, keep economic progress moving even if it's overinflated, and the people won't rebel and take over the North China Plain. So their solution? Spend more money, build more things, take out more loans and more debt because it's better than the alternative. A recession in China would spell disaster for the government. That's their whole thing, trading freedom for prosperity. They know a recession is eventually inevitable, especially after lockdowns, and so are tightening their control, waiting for the pop. Which gets us to the last of the 3 hurdles, security. China uses a lot of stuff, but here's the issue. China doesn't have a lot of stuff. Luckily, they have oceanfront property and a world to buy from, but there's Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and also the USA in the way. Also called the first island chain, also called China's nightmare. China has always been a little lacking in the naval department, and only a couple times under the Ming dynasty have really gone out of their region and sailed the ocean blue. They rely on this waterway but don't really have control over it. If something were to happen to these seas and China couldn't get stuff in and out, there would be a catastrophe. Sure, if they lost access to exporting, then it would mean the collapse of investment, finance, prosperity, and likely the government after the chaos that would happen right after. But if they lost access to imports, it would mean the collapse of Chinese society, losing access to the materials to keep them not just growing, but industrialized, powered, and fed. It's why China has been so aggressive in the South China Sea, even dumping sand in the middle of the ocean and calling it a new island. But hey, massive useless projects isn't something new to spend on if it promotes Chinese unity, right? From the Pacific side, they need to pass the first and second island chains, but from the Indian Ocean side, they need to pass the Strait of Malacca, Indonesia's tiny corridors, the Indian Peninsula, the Strait of Hormuz and Arabian Peninsula, the Red Sea, and perhaps the Mediterranean seas to get trade from pretty much 2/3 of the areas they import from. If anything were to happen in these chokeholds, or any middle power got a wild idea of stealing a cargo ship for quick money, then China at the end of the line with its weak navy would be pretty helpless. The scariest of these products to lose is energy related products, aka big barrels of oil from mostly the Mid-East. China has an energy shortage. Renewable energy does not generate enough power for the massive Chinese population and industry, so they have two options: either mine a bunch of inefficient and dirty coal or import a ton of oil. They do both. Even though coal makes up around 60% of their energy generation, China still imports an insane amount of petroleum, from Russia via the pipes and from everywhere else via the water, both very vulnerable to any attacks. Petroleum is useful for keeping the lights on, yes, but also for moving all of your exports and turning into petrochemicals. Chemicals made by petroleum related products also happens to be one of China's largest exports. Things like plastics, pharmaceuticals, rubber, and fertilizer. Oh yeah, and they still also need energy for their other manufactured products as well. Electronics, clothes, steel, and everything you see here. Then of course, there are the metals imported from places like Australia, of which China is the biggest importer and consumer in the world of, needing them to build things like these. Lastly, there's agriculture. China has a lot of land, sure, but it's also dry and has an insane amount of people as well, and an insane amount of growth led to an old farmland now buried in cement. This leads to a country with less farmland per person than Saudi Arabia, which looks pretty much like this everywhere. So China is the largest importer of food worldwide. If something were to happen to their imports, then the nation has to make a choice between deindustrializing in a major way or letting a couple 100 million starve. What's more important than food though? Water. You need water for everything, and China is running out of it. The north is extremely dry but also extremely dense. The rivers just don't provide enough water for northern China, so they're using up their groundwater supplies. It might only be 1 or 2 decades before it's all gone, so the new plan is to transfer it up from the wet south. I mean, when has a mass irrigation plan ever failed in Chinese history? But the south also happens to slope south too, meaning the rivers which spawn there feed into southern nations like India, Thailand, and Vietnam. If water supplies were tampered with, these nations would be pretty pissed and might launch a couple bombs at dams to keep their water flowing. And the other way to fix the water problem is to import even more food. The more foreign food in their diet means the less Chinese water needed to make that food, which means the more water they can save. Unfortunately, the water problem in China just leads back to their extreme dependence on imports, a dependence they cannot defend navally, one which they'll spend any money trying to fix, and a dependence that means if things go wrong with China on the global stage, then you won't be seeing the same China on that global stage afterwards. So what does this all mean? Who cares if China doesn't exist, right? Well, first of all the Chinese will care. It's an authoritarian state which has done quite well to make many people who don't live there pretty mad at it. But don't be so quick to cheer if they come crashing down. A globalized world without a China is just a de-globalized world. I don't know you, but I guarantee you rely on either China-made steel, electronics, chemicals, fertilizers that make your food, pesticides, finance, vehicle parts, wood, refined petroleum, building materials, plastics, and everything cheap every single day of your life. Their manufacturing sector is just too strong, but as a demographic collapse pulls Chinese labor out of the cheap and easy territory and into the actually comes with a cost territory, while still keeping their dependence on imports and the quality the same, I doubt anywhere near the same level of manufacturing will exist in China in a decade or so. That collapsing population, along with extreme industrialization, lack of inputs, and hyper-financing, which has gone global by the way, terrify the current Chinese government. Expect even more insane projects in the name of Chinese unity. Maybe something irrational like, grabbing an island over here or something. Expect an increasingly tyrannical government to watch everyone's every move in China, but if it collapses and the North China Plain gets into one of its very typical civil wars, the new government after the CCP will still tighten control and try to unify China under their control. So just as fast as China came into the modern world, they can easily slip out of it if they make the wrong moves or until their hyper-financing and demographics blow up in their face. The second explosion of China is definitely not an unlikely scenario, but don't expect China or your life to be any better because of it.